All right, let's get started. Thanks for tuning in. For those of you who don't know me, allow me a moment to introduce myself. My name is Marco Rodriguez, along with my lovely wife, Diane. We own Transformations Rehabilitation Services, an outpatient rehab facility in El Paso, Texas, offering physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and neurofeedback services. Diane and I have both been OTs for well over 25 years. Diane previously worked for the Slater School District, and I worked for the Sierra Providence Health Network on the stroke and brain injury unit. I'm also good with numbers, so for several years I was a case mix coordinator running statistical analysis for the Regions Network. Diane and I were both blessed. We enjoyed our jobs and thought that's what we would do for the rest of our life. But how many of you know sometimes life has different plans? And for us, that came when 2 of my 6 children were struggling in school, resulting in their being placed in special education. We're trying to find viable treatment solutions. We came across a treatment strategy called Neurofeedback. And I remember when Dr. Jacqueline Grueling, the neuropsychologist working for the Sierra Providence Health Network, was having great success with her stroke and TBI patients using neurofeedback. We decided to give neurofeedback a try, and needless to say, both of my sons responded exceptionally well, so much so that their physician encouraged us to establish an outpatient rehab facility utilizing the same interventions that it works well with them. We opened our doors in 2013. Little did I know that a few years later, I myself would become a stroke survivor. On July 3rd of 2021, I experienced a large hemorrhagic stroke, a ruptured aneurysm. Unlike an ischemic stroke, a ruptured aneurysm is where one or more arteries in the brain ruptures, causing extensive bleeding and damage. The neurosurgeon explained how repairing these types of injuries often requires titanium coils. Mine was so large, it required 10 titanium coils. I was in a coma and in ICU for several weeks, after which I went through extensive inpatient rehab, including PT, OT, speech, and other cognitive interventions. While my inpatient rehab was well spent and I did make some progress, it wasn't until I was discharged and I began a regimen of interventions targeting the neuroplasticity capabilities of my brain, and I began to see an acceleration in my progress. Now, here's some interesting facts that might help better explain how and why our services can help your patients. According to the Brain Injury Association of America, every year 52,000 people die of a traumatic brain injury. According to the National Stroke Association, 130,000 Americans die every year, primarily from a hemorrhagic stroke like the one that I experienced. Globally, that amounts to over 500,000 deaths worldwide. Half of those victims are younger than 50. For those who do survive, many of them are left with disabilities so severe, leaves them unable to perform even the most basic daily activities. While PT, OT, and speech interventions have their place, we believe it only addresses half of the problem, and here's what I mean. Many of my OT and PT colleagues will agree that one of the biggest frustrations when working a stroke or a traumatic brain injury patient is working tirelessly on issues related to tone, hemiparesis, and the like, and we do that through passive range of motion, weight-bearing activities, and other interventions such as E-STEM, PNF, NDT, only to see that progress lost in a matter of months and sometimes weeks post-discharge. And don't misunderstand, no one's to blame. The problem is traditional therapeutic interventions are focused on treating the body to address an issue that originated in the brain. Now, if you're a stroke survivor, maybe this will help explain what I mean. Typically, before any type of brain injury or a stroke, your arms and legs did what you wanted them to do, right? They didn't have a mind of their own, acting independently. Messages were sent down from the opposite side of the brain, down the spinal cord, into your arm via the peripheral nervous system. However, after a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, those messages can get interrupted, causing them to no longer flow as they should, resulting in cognitive as well as physical disabilities, including weakness and paralysis known as hemiparesis and hemiplegia, respectively. With a traditional therapeutic approach, the idea is that by working directly on the extremities, those messages might make their way up through the peripheral nervous system, the spinal cord, and eventually the brain. And while there is some evidence to support this theory, often the results are minimal and short-lived at best. At Transformations Rehab, in addition to PT, OT, and speech, we continue Dr. Grueling's work utilizing QEEG-based neurofeedback for our stroke and TBI patients in order to better address at the source, thus improving brain health and function. With our QEEG technology, we have the ability to measure disrupted neuroelectrical patterns and create a three-dimensional image of the electrical activity of the brain. Our quantitative data reports not only identifies which brain patterns are dysregulated, but also also which part of the brain is affected as well as how far from the standard deviation. This information is compared to a national database to better identify potential dysfunction. In addition, this information is utilized by our referring physicians, PT, OT, and speech therapists, as well as neurofeedback practitioners. Now, most people do understand what physical therapy is, occupational therapy, and speech therapy. However, we find most individuals are unfamiliar with neurofeedback. Even many health professionals don't really understand the potential impact of utilizing neurofeedback. Keep in mind, there are over 2,000 research articles published in the National Library of Medicine highlighting the efficacy of neurofeedback dating all the way back to the 1960s. What's even more surprising is that 98% of the research has occurred over the past 20 years. Now, why is that important? Researchers are no longer trying to figure out if neurofeedback works. The science is undeniable. Researchers are trying to figure out how to make it better by utilizing state-of-the-art technology. So let's take a few minutes to discuss what neurofeedback is and what neurofeedback is not. And we'll start with what neurofeedback is not. And neurofeedback is not shock therapy or any type of TMS. Neurofeedback is a non-invasive approach utilizing the principles of operant conditioning as coined by Dr. B.F. Skinner over 100 years ago. But we do it at the neurologic level. And in order to better understand how neurofeedback works, keep in mind the brain is made up of over 100 billion interconnected neurons or brain cells. Those brain cells, or those neurons, are in constant communication. Communication happens two ways. One is chemical, the other is electrical. Electrically, we can measure it with an EEG. We use next generation quantitative EEG, which formulates a three-dimensional image of the brain's electrical activity, identifying not only which brain patterns are dysregulated, but also which part of the brain is affected, as well as how far from the standard deviation. And why is that important to you? Because the neurons or the brain cells are interconnected, damage to one part of the brain may lead to a disruption in the synchronization or the flow of brain patterns, as well as the coherence, which means the organization of electrical patterns, including irregularities in amplitude as well as frequency. Now, there are different types of brainwave frequencies. Each serves a particular role in brain activity. Here's a list of the top 6 and their primary roles. First, we start off with delta waves. Now, delta waves are the slowest, vibrating at under 4 cycles per second. Delta waves dominate primarily when you're in your sleep cycle, so we know that most people with disrupted delta waves have dysregulated sleep cycles. Next, we move on to theta waves, which are a little faster than delta. They vibrate at 4 to 8 cycles per second. Theta waves dominate in your brain when you're in what is called a hypnagogic state, which means you're not asleep, but you're not fully awake either. You're in that in-between state. What's interesting to note is that most persons who are in a comatose state tend to have widely dispersed dominating delta and theta waves. All right, next we move on to alpha waves. Alpha waves are a little faster, vibrating at 8 to 13 cycles per second. And they dominate in your brain when you are in a normal, calm, wake state. Included in the alpha waves are a subcategory called mu waves. These are associated with the motor cortex. As we continue with the faster frequencies, we come across beta waves. Comparatively speaking, beta waves are much faster, vibrating at 13 to 30 cycles per second, dominating in a person's brain when you are active, alert, in a focused mental state. Beta waves further divided into low beta and high beta, representing the different arousal levels. For example, high beta waves are important for persons participating in a competitive event, such as football or even combat sport like martial arts or for the military. And you hear athletes talk about being in the zone. Neurologically, that represents having very strong beta waves at that time. And as wonderful as beta waves are, you don't want to be stuck in that state. In other words, you don't want to live there. And the reason being is because persons who are chronically in a state of beta tend to experience very high levels of anxiety, and in some extreme cases, PTSD has been linked to chronic levels of beta waves. All right, let's move on to gamma waves. Gamma waves are the fastest of the 6, frequencies of 30 to 100 cycles per second. Gamma waves are associated with cognitive functions like memory, attention, and problem solving. They contribute to the processing of information and conscious perception, your perception of reality, as well as coordinating all the other different functions of your brain during heightened mental activities. So, as you can see, All of the different brainwave patterns plays a specific role in cognitive and motor functions. Brain tissue injury can cause damage to the neural network and can alter the functional connectivity between different brain regions as demonstrated in this image. These changes can have widespread and often predictable changes in the overall brainwave activity as the brain attempts to adapt to new conditions. For example, in an ischemic stroke resulting from a clot, it's usually characterized by an increase in the dominance of the slower oscillating waves, including delta and theta, as shown in this image. This is often associated with decreased alertness and, in extreme cases, coma and generalized cognitive impairment. Some stroke survivors may experience an increased risk of epileptic activity, leading to abnormal electrical activities in the brain. This can manifest as seizures, impacting and even disrupting brainwave patterns further. Let me stop here and say this. Certainly, there are limitations to brain recovery, as there is for the body in general. For example, the brain can no more replace an excised portion of the brain any more than your body can regrow an amputated limb. The human body doesn't have that capability. However, within reason, your body and brain can adapt. Your brain can modify its neural networks. So, how does neurofeedback help with all of this? Let me say it this way. Utilizing neurofeedback targets damaged brain regions associated with motor skills, memory, attention, and emotional regulation, just to name a few. Often, when a person experiences a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, the normal connectivity between brain regions becomes disrupted. Neurofeedback helps to restore the disrupted connectivity between those various brain regions, either by facilitating the establishment of new pathways or strengthening existing but possibly damaged ones, thereby reducing functional impairment. It's not just physical or cognitive impairments. Often, the emotional aftermath a stroke survivor experiences can also impede their progress. Many stroke survivors report increased stress, anxiety, depression. Neurofeedback helps individuals regulate brain activity, reducing the emotional disarray. Although non-invasive, neurofeedback provides patients with real-time feedback and allows active participation in your overall brain recovery, potentially accelerating the rehabilitative process as an adjunct, of course, to your traditional occupational therapy, speech therapy, and physical therapy. All right, hopefully that's making sense so far. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. How does this work? All patients start with a QEEG brain map study from which we develop the individualized protocols addressing their specific brainwave disruptions based on the location and the extent of the injury. For instance, in this case, we see this patient has a dysregulated delta, theta, and alpha scores. Ideally, we would want all of their standard deviation scores to be as close to zero as possible. I don't see that very often, but typically a standard deviation score between -2 and +2 is considered within functional limits. So this patient is not too far from that. So we set the target at 1 or 2 standard deviations below their current score. The information is entered into the software. Sensors are placed according to the Brodmann area that we're going to train. In this case, the right parietal lobe. The patient then engages in activities like a video game or watching a movie, all of which will respond according to the patient's brainwave activity. In other words, the reward of watching the movie is all based upon the patient's ability to maintain the brainwave activity within the desired parameters. As the patient brainwave patterns get closer to the target range, the game is activated. When the brainwave patterns move away from the target range, the game becomes glitchy, it stutters, sputters, so it kind of looks like this. We can also use movies or TV shows, same principle. As a patient is watching the movie or show and their brainwave activity functions within the target parameters, they're rewarded by being able to watch the movie. However, when the brainwave activity goes outside of the target parameters, the movie or show becomes very distorted, so you get spots or maybe some pixelation. The further away from the target range, the bigger the distortion. And every time the brainwave activity goes back toward the target range, the movie clears up. For those who are unable to focus on a screen, either due to visual impairment or because of low cognition, we use music. I remember Dr. Grueling saying that one of her secrets to helping so many patients with low arousal was reducing theta and delta waves while simultaneously increasing alpha waves, and the whole thing was tied into the activation of very pleasant music. So as you can see, we not only use traditional therapeutic interventions such as PT, OT, and speech, but we also utilize neurofeedback neurofeedback to take a more top-down approach. And when combined with some of our other technologies, such as EMG biofeedback, the results are second to none. So how can this translate into the real world? Here's a good example. This is a young man. He's about, he was 15 years old when he came to us. At 7 years old, sustained a traumatic brain injury, and he'd been in special education for 8 years. He presented with not only cognitive deficits, but speech impediments, as well as gross and fine motor deficiencies. He was evaluated, and we created the neurofeedback protocols. He began therapy in addition to following the home program, including the nutritional protocols. 4 months later, he got his report card, and his academic progress skyrocketed. Hopefully you're getting this. Remember, after 8 years in special education, it took us 4 months of following the protocols to the letter, and he was able to test out of special education. He is now at UTEP studying mechanical engineering with plans on joining the United States Space Force, designing jet and rocket engines. Now, granted, his results are a bit atypical. They're extraordinary, actually, but it does demonstrate what is possible. And for this young man, it changed his life. So in case you're wondering, yes, we do see results similar to this of persons regardless of their age or their background. And with that, we're going to have to wrap it up. I apologize, I've gone over my time. If you have any questions, feel free to call the office, and we'd be more than happy to answer your questions. Thanks a lot, and God bless you.